All right, today we're going to talk about one of the wildest, most powerful, and frankly, most paradoxical ideas in all of military strategy: deterrence. And this isn't really about the weapons themselves. It's about psychology. It's about persuasion. It's basically a giant global game of chicken. So, how on earth does it actually work? Yeah, think about that for a second. How do you win a game where making any move means you lose? This question, it gets to the absolute heart of the puzzle. For decades, this is the exact logic that has defined the standoff between the world's superpowers. The goal isn't to fight and win. The goal is to convince your opponent that fighting would be so unbelievably catastrophic that it's not even worth considering. Okay, so how does this whole thing work in practice? Well, to really get it, first we have to be clear about what deterrence is not. It's not about building some kind of super shield, an impenetrable defense to protect yourself. Nope. It's all about forging the biggest, most terrifying sword you possibly can. Right. So at its core, deterrence is all about persuasion. It's a threat, plain and simple. The message is crystal clear. Hey, don't even think about attacking me, because if you do, the consequences will be something you absolutely cannot handle. It's a strategy aimed squarely at an adversary's mind, right? The whole goal is to shape their calculations before they even think about making a move. And this is where we see the really crucial difference. Look at this comparison. Defense, that's physical. It's about your capabilities, it's about denial, stopping an attack that's already happening. Deterrence, though, that's a whole different ballgame. It's purely psychological. It works by threatening punishment, trying to get inside the enemy's head and change their intentions so that an attack never ever gets launched in the first place. Before the atomic age, this was a lot simpler. Deterrence and defense were pretty much two sides of the same coin. You had an army to scare people off, and if that didn't work, well, you used that same army to defend yourself. But then, nuclear weapons came along, and they didn't just change the game, they blew it up. Suddenly, this idea of deterrence became the central pillar of global security. And this is where we get to probably the single most unsettling fact about this entire strategy. I mean, think of all the money, all the brain power, all the resources poured into nuclear deterrence. And guess what? It's all just a theory. Now, thankfully, and I mean thankfully, no two nuclear powers have ever actually gone to full-scale war. But that also means everything we think we know is based on logic and deduction, not on cold, hard, real-world proof. So here's the thing about not having any real-world tests. It leaves us with some massive, and I mean massive, uncertainties. Like, what do these weapons actually deter? We don't know for sure. And how many do you need? What's the magic number? There's no reliable answer. And maybe the biggest one of all, your credibility. Whether your threat is even believable, that depends completely on what your enemy thinks, not on what you think. So, as you can imagine, these huge uncertainties have led to decades of fierce debate among strategists. And it all really boils down to three big, fundamental questions that honestly are still unresolved. So let's call them the three nuclear riddles. Okay, riddle number one. How far does this nuclear shield actually go? Are we just talking about protecting your own country from a direct hit? Or can you, and should you, use this threat to cover your friends and allies too? And right there, that's the difference between what experts call immediate deterrence and extended deterrence. Think back to the Cold War. The United States wasn't just using its nuclear arsenal to protect America. It was also promising to use them to stop a potential Soviet invasion of its allies in Western Europe. And that's a much trickier promise to make, right? It's a lot more complex, and you could argue a lot less believable. Which leads us perfectly into our second riddle. And this one is probably the most famous of them all. It cuts right to the heart of the whole strategy: credibility. I mean, think it through. If an enemy actually launches a nuclear strike against you, they've already called your bluff. Your country is devastated. So why would you retaliate? What's the rational point of launching your missiles when you've already lost? This is the central paradox. Logically, once deterrence has failed, a rational leader has absolutely nothing to gain by striking back. It just ensures total annihilation for everyone. So, is the whole thing a giant bluff? Well, not exactly. This is where strategists bring up something called the rationality of irrationality. Basically, to make your threat believable, you have to convince your enemy that you are so committed or so angry or maybe just crazy enough to push that button no matter what, even if it's total suicide. Your credibility literally depends on them believing you might act completely irrationally. All right, on to riddle number 3. This one's all about the hardware. How much firepower do you actually need to be persuasive? Is having just one bomb that can wipe out a city enough to do the trick? Or do you need thousands of warheads with all sorts of different ways to deliver them? And this question really splits the experts into two main camps. On one side, you have the idea of existential deterrence. These guys argue that just the sheer horror, the unthinkability of nuclear war is enough. As long as you can't be completely disarmed in a surprise first attack, what they call a survivable second strike capability, then your threat is real. But then you have the flexible response folks. They say, hold on a second, an enemy might gamble. They might try a smaller, limited attack, betting that you wouldn't be willing to start a global apocalypse over it. So they argue you need a whole menu of options, from small-scale tactical strikes to conventional responses, so you can make your threat credible for every level of aggression, not just the big one.
So the Cold War is over, right? But these riddles, they haven't gone anywhere. In fact, you could say things have gotten even messier. That old, simple model of just two superpowers staring each other down, well, that's been shattered into a million far more complex and unpredictable pieces.
See, the old Cold War model was built on one huge assumption, that your opponent was a rational state, that it wanted to survive, and that it had a return address you could target. But that assumption just falls apart when you're talking about modern threats. I mean, how do you deter a terrorist group that doesn't have a country to defend and might actually welcome martyrdom? Or how about a rogue state led by someone whose logic is just completely alien to yours? The threat of punishment, it just doesn't have the same bite. And that really brings us to the fundamental challenge of deterrence today. The whole system, everything we've talked about, is built on communication. It's a threat that has to be sent, has to be received, and most importantly, it has to be understood. So what happens when you're in a world full of actors who are playing by a completely different set of rules, or maybe aren't even listening? That's the profoundly unsettling question we're left with.